All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Robert Baumann, who is a Russian historian and was previously director of degree programs at the Command and General Staff College and a professor and Ministry of Defense Education advisor for the Armed Forces Academy of Uzbekistan. Additionally, Dr. Baumann is the author of several books and many articles regarding Russian and American military history. Lastly, he's also my dad. So, Dad, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
It's okay. My pleasure.
That's right. Only had to pay you a lot of money, but you
Yeah, that's
eventually
right.
caved.
That's right. Long negotiations, protracted process. Yeah.
Took years. So just starting off, when did you first become aware of the Soviet Union as a child growing up?
Uh, Interesting question. I would say that it was about the age of 9, maybe 10, uh, after we moved to Wisconsin. I'd lived in a variety of places prior to that, and it was probably just a matter of age, but I think also a matter of location. Wisconsin, and to pin this down, we moved there in I think the winter of 1960, 1961. And Wisconsin, by virtue of its own history, was probably a little bit more tapped into the Cold War than some other places. And that's because Joe McCarthy had been a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. And he had stoked a good deal of controversy, both nationally and within the state. But because of his presence in Wisconsin, I think there was probably a higher level of consciousness about the Cold War than in perhaps some other places. And he was famous for Joe McCarthy got a lot of people in Wisconsin fired up about the communist threat.
Yeah.
Now, he would soon be censured by the United States Senate for ridiculous excesses. He was pointing fingers in all directions across the State Department, the military, and so on and so forth. But for a while, he wielded enough influence that a lot of people, including President Eisenhower, were a little bit reluctant to confront him publicly. So this frenzy, what they call the Red Scare, was kind of unchecked for a year or two. But in any case, even after McCarthy is personally discredited and is out of the Senate, a lot of this stuff lingers in Wisconsin politics. So in the decade of the 60s, in our district in southern Wisconsin, in our state senatorial district, there was a state senator who was very much a Joe McCarthy acolyte, who talked a lot of the same game about the communist threat. And I remember as a somewhat audacious high school student going up to his office at the state capitol one day, just dropping in the summertime. And he was very friendly, very effusive. Oh, the son of some people from my district was great. And after a little chit chat, he decided to tend to my education a little bit and took me over to a stack of files and told me that these were his communist files, and proceeded to tell me that he had determined that there were about 35,000 active communists in the state of Wisconsin, which I thought was rather spectacular. In any case, that gave me a pretty good indication of the level of concern in some places. Now, the way he had constructed this list, and this is now the late 1960s, it was about probably 1968 that I visited his office. And by then, you had a lot of anti-war protests and people signing petitions against the war in Vietnam and so on and so forth. Those were loaded wholesale into his files. So that was how the list was built in large part. But in any case, this was something that folks were excited about. My first experience encountering it directly was probably in school, where we had some videos, I recall, about the communist threat. And I can remember one in particular that talked about the danger of communists taking over local PTAs and drawing out meetings till late into the evening when ordinary folks would would want to retire and go home, and then they would, control the majority late in the evening and implement a new curriculum and stuff like that. So there were many aspects of it. Of course, I also became aware in the early 60s of what the threat of nuclear war was about. And of course, as a 10-year-old, almost 10-year-old, I got to experience the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you have, neighbors stocking up on food, and you learn that some people have, basement fallout shelters and so on and so forth. And there was a period there of a week or so when folks were very seriously contemplating the possibility that we might be in a war, and that would take me back to some of the videos that we'd seen in school about, how you may be directed to crawl underneath your desk, and you'll be directed not to look out the windows because there's going to be this blinding flash that will destroy your eyesight, and so on and so forth. So it was a little bit graphic, and it's kind of, today they would probably not do things like that with kids of that age, but they felt it was important to educate us. And anyway, it wasn't hard to start to pick up the vibe that there was serious concern that we had a not so friendly rivalry with the Soviet Union, and it was all something to worry about. So that did a lot to propel my interest in Russia, and later my interest in studying the Russian language and so on, because it was this strange, formidable seeming country that posed an active threat, had a very different worldview, and it was all rather opaque. We didn't know what was going on there because so few people went there, and it was very, very restrictive and whatnot. So the mystery of it all kind of drew me in.
Yeah. So I'm curious then, when you were growing up, how did your parents talk to you about the Cold War or the Soviet Union, or did they talk about much at all? Or
they did some. I wouldn't say my parents were very political, but they were politically aware.
Yeah.
And they were aware of the conflict. Of course, my father had been in the Air Force for a few years when I was very young, and so he had gotten some glimpses of that from a military perspective. So when elections would come up, certainly one of the issues that my parents would consider would be, who's got the most sensible stance with regard to the Soviet Union, the risks of nuclear war, and so on and so on.
Yeah. And I mean, the Vietnam War was going on when you were in high school.
Right. The Vietnam War, of course, is something else that keeps it on the front, and it ties directly with the feelings about the Soviet Union in general, because the Soviet Union was not regarded merely as a large country. It was the center of an international communist movement that sought to spread the ideology and expand into different countries, establish communist regimes, and so on and so forth. There was the domino theory that emerged that if you let one country fall, then the next one will fall, and that was a part of the reasoning that got the United States into Vietnam after the French withdrew. There was kind of a feeling, well, somebody's going to have to step in there and stabilize the situation. The United States had very few experts on East Asia and virtually none on Vietnam. So we were navigating almost blind heading into Vietnam. We were influenced by the French perspective, which was that communism was a great threat, but not a great enough threat that France was going to stick it out and stay there. They finally decided the war was not worth the effort, and withdrew. And we filled in. And so it started out with a small commitment in the late 50s with advisors being sent, and then a few thousand special forces under the Kennedy administration And then the turning point, which would have some downrange implications, was in 1964. You're about a year and a half, less than a year, past the assassination of President Kennedy and the ascension to the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And in the summer of 64, you had the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. That was a series of 2 incidents of clashes or perceived clashes between U.S. naval vessels and the North Vietnamese. It later turned out that one of those incidents almost certainly didn't happen, even though it may have been perceived to have happened, that there was bad weather at sea, and they thought they were under fire, and folks jumped to conclusions. In the Senate, there's a resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is passed with only 2 dissenting votes, that basically gives Lyndon Johnson a blank check to do whatever is necessary to secure American interests in the Far East. So this means that Lyndon Johnson doesn't have to spend political capital pleading with the Congress to get support. He's got this resolution, which was widely supported, so there wasn't going to be a great deal of dissent early on anyway, that lets him do whatever he feels necessary. And so we begin to escalate the presence of U.S. forces to the point where by 67 or so, we're upwards of 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So suddenly something that was very small grew very large. In order to sustain that kind of troop level, the United States had to rely on the draft, conscription. And initially, that's not a big problem, but as the war grinds on for a couple of years and the signs of progress are not all that convincing, that too becomes a serious concern. And then you start to have lots of anti-war protests and lots of anti-draft protests among college-age young people in the United States. And the controversy is really overflowing. So the Vietnam War, in one sense, though you could say well-intended, meandered down a trail that was unanticipated and soon perceived not to be so conducive to American interests, after all, at least by a significant share of the population. So the tipping point then politically in 1968 was the 68 presidential election campaign, in which the Vietnam War was probably the biggest and by far the most controversial issue. On the Democratic side, there was a group of folks waiting for a candidate to step forward who would oppose the war, and that individual turned out to be Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, whose campaign took off. And this was actually does bring to mind a moment that, again, I have some personal knowledge of. In the last couple of weeks leading up to the Wisconsin primary, early in the presidential campaign, Wisconsin had the second or third primary at the time after New Hampshire. So it was very significant as an indicator of where the public was going. And my father, who was growing increasingly skeptical about the war, took me and a close friend of mine to a McCarthy campaign rally in the Dane County Coliseum in Madison, Wisconsin. And they had just a huge bursting overflow crowd. And the place was just electric with energy. It was like being at a really tense football game or something like that. I mean, the crowd was really pumped. So I remember that rally very well. And that also seems to be an indicator of the kind of momentum the McCarthy campaign was generating. And then virtually on the eve of the Wisconsin primary, just a few days before, President Johnson gave a national address, and he closed his address by announcing that he was withdrawing from the race for the presidency and would not seek re-election, which was absolutely astonishing. And then, of course, that created a change in the dynamics of the campaign. Senator Bobby Kennedy, who had earlier declined to come forward as a candidate, now wanted in. And a lot of the party machinery supported him, not all by any means, but given the Kennedy family influence, which was still very strong, his campaign took off. And then it's a horse race down to the end. And the last major events of the primary campaign were primary races in Oregon and California. And McCarthy won in Oregon, but Kennedy won with a small lead in California, and that looked like that might propel him to the top. And then, of course, in the very night, at his campaign California headquarters, where they were celebrating victory, he's assassinated. And I just remember how astonishing that was.
Yeah, for sure.
And apparently, he lingered for a few hours before he died. But it was all part of an incredibly shocking year. And then it turns out the sitting vice president, Hubert Humphrey, is the one who wins the nomination. He is stuck in limbo between support for his boss, the president, and his realization that if you're not going to be opposed to the war, you're going to have a hard time generating much support for your campaign. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, Richard Nixon, who was in the midst of his great comeback, he had lost the 1960 election campaign to John Kennedy by a whisker. And some would argue still by virtue of the votes of a few dead people in Chicago. But Nixon won a very close race. I remember they were still counting votes the next day, but Nixon won, and his position had been that we would pursue the war to an honorable peace. He had a plan that was never exactly elaborated, and Richard Nixon would intensify the war for a while. There would be cross-border operations in Cambodia, for example, in the spring of 1970 that would be hugely controversial and would just light a fire across many college campuses in the United States. Of course, a lot of this is why there's been some comparison drawn between the year 1968 and maybe 69 and what we've been experiencing in the United States lately. Comparisons can be somewhat misleading, but also intriguing. Anyway, that was all part of the Cold War. And then Nixon does an amazing pivot as president. Again, it shows the peculiarity of political dynamics, because Nixon had built his career on being a staunch anti-communist. And then in 1972, he will amaze everyone by having Henry Kissinger secretly arrange for Nixon to visit China, communist China. And the visit itself isn't secret, it's well publicized. And it brings about a détente between the United States and China, which suddenly puts the Soviet Union in a tough spot, because suddenly China has broken ranks very clearly with the Soviet Union on matters of international politics. Nixon has had a breakthrough. As some have put it, only Nixon could go to China. Only someone with those kind of anti-communist credentials would have the credibility with at least some parts of the American public to meet with the Chinese and not be himself branded some kind of a leftist or a communist. So it was all kind of amazing. But the winding down of the Cold War I think is traceable to those events in 1972. And at the same time, Nixon is also pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam. He has also eliminated the draft. So there have been some rather big changes in the domestic scene that bring things back to normal. So anyway, the whole communist thing was a constant in American politics for several decades, and always with the sense that there was a very serious threat at hand.
Yeah. So were your parents concerned at all during the Vietnam War era that you would get drafted?
They didn't talk about it much, but I think that's probably
Yeah.
true. I think they were probably crossing their fingers and hoping it would wind down before it was my turn, and that's about the way it worked out.
Okay.
I was in the draft lottery, which had been created. They had redesigned the draft. It originally had been conducted by local draft boards, which would review the files of all the age-eligible young men from their particular community or district and basically determine who was going to be drafted. And they switched to a lottery system, in part because local draft boards were wildly inconsistent in their approach to things. I later on had a colleague at the Command and General Staff College who had grown up in Seattle, and he was talking about how when his draft year, which was a few years before mine, in short, someone stood up in front of the assembly and just asked people, everyone who has a doctor's note excusing you from military service for physical reasons, please raise your hand or stand up or something like that. And then he summarily dismissed all of them. There was no verification of records or anything, just dismissed a throng of people. So you could have, as I said, there was great inconsistency in the conduct of draft boards. The lottery made it more fair, and it was done literally like a lottery. There would be this almost like a game show, and they would have this bubble machine with ping pong balls, and they would all have a number which would designate the day of the year of a particular birthday, and they would pull them out one at a time and rank order them until you had it down to 365, and those who drew a low enough number were susceptible to be drafted depending on the need that year. Now, my draft number, it was the last year that the lottery meant anything at all. My draft number was 23. Any previous year, I would have been drafted. But in the year, I can't remember exactly when they conducted the lottery, but it would have been between 71 and 72. And I'm not sure they drafted anybody at all, or if they did, it was a minuscule number. So it just didn't happen. Simple as that.
So when you were given a draft number, showing that all of a sudden you've become eligible, like, is that something that kind of changes your perspective on the whole thing? Like, it becomes more real because you actually have an assigned number now, or how does that work?
Well, once you're in the, no, I wouldn't say that made it more real. Maybe it would intensify it.
Yeah.
But everybody was issued a draft card.
Sure.
So that you would know that you were on the master list,
right?
And conceivably be picked. In fact, one of the forms of protest was to burn your draft card. There would be sometimes groups of students who would burn their draft cards in public and be with TV cameras and whatnot. And I would be mistaken not to emphasize the incredible role that television played in all of this, because national television was still a relatively new thing. And it brought an immediacy to all kinds of news stories that had never happened before. And the presence of television reporters and video cameramen in Vietnam was also extraordinary. No war previously had ever had that kind of coverage. So Americans were getting glimpses of the war in Vietnam unlike anything that had ever come before. And that also made it more difficult for the government to sustain an official narrative of the war and what was going on. Also, the Vietnam War itself, because it was a guerrilla war to a large extent without fronts, made it incredibly hard to measure progress. It also made it incredibly easy to lie or mislead
Yeah.
about progress. In some parts of the country, there was significant progress. In other parts, no progress practically whatsoever. So that was also a very mixed bag.
Yeah. So then thinking, further on in your lifetime, then when you get to college and stuff, how do you get interested in Russia more?
Okay. Well, I mean, by the time I was up for the draft, I was already in college.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Okay.
so that was between my sophomore and junior years. And uh, simple things in part came into play. I chose a college, Dartmouth College, that not only had a Russian program, but had an exchange program with Leningrad University, which was something a little bit unusual. And Dartmouth also had a foreign language requirement. And I had taken Latin in high school and wasn't anxious to continue that track.
Okay.
So, hey, let's dive in, let's do Russian. And that got me into the foreign study program at Leningrad University and so on and so forth. So at the fairly young age of 19, I was a student in the Soviet Union for a little while, and it was interesting and very eye-opening. You had the imaginary Soviet Union sort of in the back of your mind, and then you got to visit the real place. And I can remember thinking again and again to myself, I can't believe I'm here. I can't
Yeah.
believe I'm here.
I mean,
Uh,
what were your
it
parents
was like
thinking?
going to Mars then. I mean, it
Yeah.
was, yeah.
That's crazy. I mean, what were your parents thinking when you told them like, "Oh, I'm going to go to the Soviet Union"?
Well, they were all for it.
Oh, okay, yeah, interesting.
Because they knew I was interested in Russian, and I think especially my father said, well, if this is the path you want to pursue, you got to be all in.
Yeah.
So yeah, you should by all means, go do this. And he was a great believer in the power of knowledge. If you become an expert at something, it will enhance your opportunities.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Okay.
it was certainly an intriguing time to visit the Soviet Union. There had been a major incident in the Vietnam War just weeks prior to the time that I and some friends from Dartmouth uh, headed off to to Leningrad. The U.S. Navy had mined Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam to complicate the Soviet Union delivering military supplies to Vietnam, to North Vietnam. So there was the potential there of a big issue if a major Soviet ship blew up or something like that due to American mines in Haiphong Harbor. Nothing in particular came of that, but it was an attention getter for just a little bit of time. The main thing I remember from that summer in Leningrad was the historically famous Fischer-Spassky chess match. The Soviets had a hammerlock on the World Chess Championship for quite a while, and Russia still has a formidable tradition in chess. But Bobby Fischer had emerged as the great American challenger to the Soviets, and in a way, he was just kind of a fitting American challenger. He was brash. He kind of was a norm breaker and a complainer. For the Soviets, he was a great object of propaganda. Okay,
Yeah.
here's the American champion. What a
Yeah.
jerk.
Yeah.
Basically. uh, and then I followed the matches in the Soviet press as this thing went on, because the World Chess Championship goes on for a long time because you have to win a certain number of matches and accumulate a certain number of points and this can stretch weeks. Uh, and so I would, look in the Soviet newspapers each morning to see what the latest results might be. There tended to be bigger coverage if Spassky won a match
Sure.
than when Fischer won. Uh, uh, but in any case, Bobby Fischer won. And that was kind of a revolution in chess. It was frustrating and embarrassing for the Soviets, um, who quietly punished Boris Spassky for losing by, kind of setting him aside. And, he was not going to be in the pantheon of heroes. Uh, and again, Bobby Fischer was quite a character who, wanted to litigate every aspect of the proceedings. He would complain about noise. He would complain about lights. He would complain about the venue. He would keep threatening to withdraw and so on and so forth. It was wild.
That
And
is
then he
pretty
won.
crazy. Jeez. I mean, well, I think this is an interesting thing though, because there's not, when people think of a Cold War era, it's probably, people don't think about these kind of intercultural exchanges where chess matches are going on, or hockey games later in the Olympics,
Yeah.
or exchange students between universities.
Yeah.
Like, the US obviously has lots of issues with Russia today, and I don't think there's many exchange programs going on. But the Cold War,
a lot of exchange programs have been curbed to a significant degree.
right? But during the Cold War, we were almost at nuclear war with the Soviets, yet we're having these exchange programs going on.
It is a little bit ironic.
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, the other big thing of 1972 was the famous hockey series between the NHL All-Stars and the Soviet national team. And that was a shockaroo because the assumption was the NHL All-Stars, who were overwhelmingly Canadian, would just clean the Soviets' clocks. And that turned out to be anything but true. They did finally win, but it was the series, but it was very, very close. And some would say at least a little bit in part attributable to the very rough, sometimes to excess Canadian style of play.
Yeah.
And I mean, there appear to have been a couple of cheap shots against Soviet players, one of whom was injured and so on. Anyway, but that also fit well into Soviet stereotypes.
Right.
Here they are. They are, folks.
Jerks. Yeah.
And that's right.
That's interesting. So what were, when you were in the Soviet Union as a 19-year-old, were you told by like the people in your program that were directing it, like, hey, be careful of this or that?
Sure.
What were the guidelines that you were told?
We were briefed on certain things ahead of time. Well, the main thing was you're in the Soviet Union, or you're in somebody else's country, and you are now accountable under their legal system. So keep that in mind. What you might think you have every right to do as an American, okay, you're going to have to file that away and accept a new template for behavior inside the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union had a closed economy, which is to say it didn't freely trade much with the West, and because the Soviet Union had not chosen to prioritize consumer goods a whole lot, Americans would find when they got there that, for example, their clothes were in demand, and you'd have people offering to buy your clothes. And of course, one of the things that we were warned about was, hey, that's not a good idea. Remember, that's against the law. You don't want to do that. Also, there was this peculiar system of Soviet stores called Beryozki, which birch trees, which were available to Soviet VIPs, foreign diplomats, and foreign tourists. The idea was for the Soviet Union to gain hard currency, so-called hard currency, like dollars, Deutschmarks, British pounds, and so on and so forth, that they could use to buy things from abroad, since the ruble didn't carry international value. It was not a circulated currency because the Soviets wanted to shield it from the international market. So anyway, there was a student who was there while I was there. He was a friend. He actually wasn't from Dartmouth. Dartmouth ran part of the exchange. There were some other schools involved. But in any case, he had a Soviet friend who wanted to do him a favor, so he went into one of these Beryozkas and bought some American cigarettes for him. And, just walked out of the store and then, handed him, a nice little grocery bag full of a couple of cartons of cigarettes. And they hadn't walked 20 yards before they were picked up by the police,
Oh,
who had
wow.
apparently been staked them out and saw what was going on. And from what he told me, he had a real interesting interview at the police station. It was classic, like movie setting. Lights are dark. There's a spotlight. So my friend was, subject to an interview for a while, and then his Russian friend was subjected to a longer interview, and a little bit harsher. But that episode kind of made the point. The rules are for real, and somebody could be watching. So.
Yeah, I mean, did you ever feel like you were being watched while you were there?
Not the first time very much, although I suppose I could have been. The next major excursion was for longer. That was my year at Moscow University, and your mother and I went as a young couple as part of this group of American graduate students. The Soviet Union and the United States had, again, an exchange program for PhD students. And they traded, I think, 32. And most of the Soviet exchange students were here to study like nuclear physics and things like that. They tended to be congregated at MIT and Caltech and whatnot. The Americans were almost entirely non-scientists. I think we had one biologist. Everybody else was a specialist in history, literature, or political science, or sociology, or something of that sort. So there was a kind of an amusing asymmetry to the exchange. But I was perfectly happy with what I got. I got to go to Moscow University. I got to be supervised by Peter Zyantkovsky, who was the leading Soviet military historian of the day. So that was pretty cool, and it was also enhanced by the fact that he was a pretty serious scholar, and he would tend to set ideology aside and let's get to work on your research project here and see what we could do. He was very helpful. He had enough influence that several times he was able to intervene on my behalf and get me access to things that I had been refused access to.
Wow.
Previously. I remember one episode it was the State History Museum right on Red Square, and I wanted to see part of their collection, and they had told me, no, we can't let you in. And one phone call from Zyantkovsky, and next thing I was welcome. So that was all just great. There were a lot of great aspects to that year in the Soviet Union, and we both made a lot of interesting friends. We were there, and got to talk a lot, late at night in the dorm room about life and world affairs and so on and so forth. So that was a really fascinating year, and I think the funniest accounts you could probably get from your mother, who has the best stories. But
sure.
In terms of being followed, I know I was on occasion once early in my tenure. I'd probably been there only a week or two before I was anxious to get out and circulate and see things, do things, meet people. I went to a soccer match at the Olympic Stadium there in Moscow, and I was really pumped. I got there like an hour before game time, so I could watch warm-ups and stuff like that. And a young man, maybe a little bit older than me, but not by much, just happened to come in. It's a nearly empty stadium, and here's a guy who takes the seat right next to me. So, and he was dressed the way I would later understand, folks working for the KGB normally dressed. They
Wow.
normally had a leather jacket, and they were kind of well dressed. But leather jacket was one of the signs. They had certain sartorial standards that were met, and so they always looked good. Anyway, we talked, before the game, through the game, and whatnot. And he asked a few questions, but he didn't seem like he was trying to probe really deeply. Although he did ask kind of what I was doing and things of that sort. But it was a good conversation, good enough conversation that I figured, hey, maybe we'll just catch a beer on the way out of the stadium or something. And as we were leaving, he took some care to make sure that as the crowd was sort of pressing through the portal to get back out, to clear the way for me, and whatnot, make sure I wasn't going to get jostled or anything like that. And we got out outside the stadium, and next thing I knew, he disappeared. This wasn't there. And so I thought, well, gee, that's odd. I thought, is he going to hang around, see if we can find each other? Never did spot him. Well, it didn't. Like, never is not the word. I didn't spot him for a couple of weeks. And then there was an international political science conference at Moscow University. And for purely pragmatic reasons, since I'm not a political scientist, I thought it would be interesting to go to the conference and listen. And also the conference was taking over all the main dining halls. So if I wanted to eat in my usual favorite places at Moscow University, I was going to have to be involved with the conference. So I signed up, and it turned out to be interesting. But what I distinctly recall in this instance is that the day I reported to the conference, lo and behold, on the steps, doing sort of plainclothes security duty, helping sort of check people on the way and keeping, was this guy who'd sat with me at the football game, at the soccer game. And so there he was. I came, I said, hey, how you doing? And of course, he made like he'd never seen me before in his life.
Wow.
So that was that. Went
So
in.
they had KGB doing security at events like that?
That was an international event. They knew there were going to be lots of foreigners.
Okay. Interesting. Wow. So why do you think he interacted with you at the beginning then? Was it just to kind of see who you were?
I think it was to check on me,
Okay.
check
Just
me
like
out.
someone told him, hey, go talk to that guy, make sure he's not.
I'm sure that I was being observed, and hey, somebody had to follow me and see what I was doing. And he drew the lucky card.
Wow. That's
So
wild.
it was, and again, it was all interesting and entertaining. There were not many other instances when I was clearly aware of being followed, but I tended to assume that I often was, and I wasn't paying a great deal of attention. The former New York Times correspondent, Hedrick Smith, who's one of the guys, by the way, that I think I heard speak before I went to the Soviet Union the second time to Moscow, had told a humorous story about his own experiences being followed while in Moscow. And he talked about a time, and I guess it was the summer, and he had two people on his tail because he was a little more important than I was.
Sure.
And anyway, he knew he was being followed and whatnot. So a hot day, he decided to stop at one of the widely available little ice cream stands. They were on carts, and folks would be, selling ice cream cones. He stopped at one of these and bought 3 cones, one for himself and one for each of his 2 tails. And it's just an amusing moment.
Sure. I mean, I think probably one of the craziest situations I remember you mentioning in the past was your time spending in a Soviet hospital.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what was going on? Explain that situation. And
Okay. Well, you actually saw that hospital, I think, when we were in Leningrad together, or St. Petersburg. But in any case, one morning I was feeling a little out of sorts in my, abdominal tract, and I think I reported to the nurse at the university, and they called in somebody to check me out. This individual thought that maybe I had appendicitis, which got things rolling. They called me an ambulance, and I was taken away to the hospital, and immediately examined by one doctor, and then sent up to a room. But the initial examination was kind of interesting. Sort of poking, does this hurt, does that hurt, and so on and so forth, and asked interesting questions. One of which was, did you serve in Vietnam? I suppose a legitimate medical reason for that would be, could you have been exposed to a tropical disease at some point? You knew I was young enough that if I had, it would have been very recently, and whatnot. But any case, the answer was no. So I went was sent up to a room in the hospital where I had two Russian roommates. So that made it kind of an interesting experience. The regime was full of things that I didn't anticipate, didn't expect, and kind of highlighted some differences between the U.S. and the USSR, and in particular in the field of medicine. Anyway, I was examined by 6 different physicians, as far as I could tell, the first day, and 3 of them said they thought I had appendicitis, and 3 of them said they thought I didn't. So that left me kind of wondering at the end of the day where this was going. In the meantime, I got to know my roommates just a little bit, and I had pretty much given up everything that I had when I was admitted to the hospital. They had my wallet, my passport, everything except my toilet bag. So I had my toothbrush and a couple of other things, and I had one book and a deck of playing cards. So I asked if my roommates were interested in playing cards. They said, "Oh, no, 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 no." And I was kind of taken aback. They explained to me that it was against the rules. I was a little bit floored. Come again? And because my Russian wasn't yet that strong. I wondered, if I'd understood this right. This was back when I was 19, again in Leningrad, and they explained to me, well, it's against the rules because they're concerned that we will gamble, and gambling is against the law. Okay, and I said, but how are we supposed to gamble? They've taken our wallets. We don't have any money, and they said, but they think they're afraid we'll keep records and settle once we get out of the hospital. Okay.
Wow.
And so I proceeded to play solitaire, and wouldn't you know, a nurse walks in and catches me playing solitaire, and gives me a scolding. And I'm telling her, "Hey, I'm just playing. It's solitaire. I'm not gambling with myself." But nevertheless, I was discouraged from playing cards. Okay. So it was a rather interesting stay. We had well, the thing that struck me most was that daily they would collect like urine samples and whatnot, and I had no idea what they were doing at first. They would just leave an empty household jar beside the bed.
Wow.
And I asked my roommates, "What's this for?" "Oh, yeah, you're supposed to provide a urine sample." "Oh, just a household jar? Nothing, no sterile cup or something that you were used to in the United States?" Yeah. So that surprised me. Also, first thing in the morning, there would be a nurse who would tell all the patients they had to get up out of their beds, walk out in the room, and into the corridors, and they would lead us in calisthenics. each morning, which I thought was unusual. But it was part of the regime to make you healthy. Um, we ate in a common cafeteria, and each day I was assigned some different table mates. Places were assigned in the cafeteria, which I thought was interesting. But I remember meeting with someone who seemed to me at the time to be an elderly woman. She was probably about 45 or 50, but perspectives change over the course of life.
Sure.
And anyway, she had brought in some small tomatoes that she said her daughter had brought her from their dacha or something in the countryside. And so we shared the tomatoes. And then she had an interesting series of questions about the United States, which were kind of evident of the nature of things. She asked me, if I liked the tomatoes. I said, oh, yeah, they're very good. And she said, well, she said, our tomatoes are tastier because, we don't use chemicals, and they're not, genetic hybrids and so on and so forth. She said, I understand your tomatoes might be larger, but ours are better. Okay. And I wasn't gonna. I was grateful for a couple of tomatoes. I wasn't gonna argue with her. Then, as the conversation rolled, she asked, "Well, do you think there's going to be war between the United States and the Soviet Union?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't think so. I think we're finding ways to understand each other and better and whatnot." And then she stood up and called for everyone's attention in the cafeteria and said, my American table mate says that we will not have a war, as though my opinion mattered. And everyone seemed very pleased. And so that was great. Another funny moment was, it was like my third day in the hospital, and I was feeling pretty chipper. And lo and behold, I noticed that way down the hall from my room, I heard some conversation in English. And I thought, well, what the heck? And it turned out an American doctor and his wife were being given an escorted tour of the hospital. And so there was a Soviet physician talking with them and explaining things as they were walking down the hall. And when they got close to my room, and I was kind of standing there in the doorway, and so I said hello. And then we had a short conversation, how are you doing and whatnot? Have you been sick, and so on and so forth. And so that was all fine. And as they, parted, the American physician's American wife turned back to me and she said, by the way, she said, I want to compliment you. Your English is excellent. I thought, how humorous that was. I mean, I've thought since about a lot of great things I should have said, but what I did say was, well, it should be. I'm from Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's a pretty good response. Even then.
It wasn't bad.
Yeah, that's funny.
But so there were funny moments. My exit interview with the hospital administrator was also kind of funny. In fact, I still have the interview form that she gave me, because I think there were a lot of things I saved from that I thought were interesting, and it describes my problem and whatnot. But the main thing was her pronouncement at the end of our little exit meeting, to the effect that you came to the Soviet Union a sick man, and we have made you well, and we wish you all the best.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was pretty cool. It was a great experience. It was fascinating. It was illuminating. It was funny. I mean, it wasn't all funny at first. I mean, it was a little nervous at first when I thought I might have surgery there.
But right, of course.
Once we got past that point, everything was fine.
So eventually, then you'd go on to become an official Russian historian. Then
yeah.
Those
I
two
did
trips
in the 1979-1980 academic year. I did dissertation research in Russian archives and libraries, again under the direction of Pyotr Andreevich Zainchkovsky, who was the famous Russian historian. And that all went well and set me up to write a dissertation and get my degree from Yale a couple of years later. So that was all good, and that propelled me into a long career in the Russian field. There were many trips to the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet space over those years. I suppose if you count all my trips to various parts of what was the Soviet Union, there were probably 35 or 40 of them.
Wow.
There were probably 25 or so to Russia out of that group, and mostly for research and whatnot. And some of them were very illuminating. I remember in 1987, I got the Commanding General Staff College allowed me to take a break to go to Russia, and I went on a short trip. It had been a couple of years since I'd been there, and I really wanted to get back in and take the pulse of the country, especially since you had this new interesting leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was now General Secretary, and setting a new tone. And that was a very illuminating trip. The climate had changed amazingly. Russians that I talked to were much freer about expressing their opinions. Russians had generally in the past always been very careful about the things they said. And they were noticeably, just obviously freer. The climate to me was, I was really surprised at how much it had changed and so fast. To the point where when I got back, there were a lot of people who were kind of skeptical of my account of how much Russia had changed. There were people who thought, oh, this was something was staged for your benefit. This was all propaganda or something. Yeah. But no, it really had changed, as everybody found out pretty quickly. Mikhail Gorbachev had a different agenda. He had concluded that the Soviet Union was generally headed for a kind of bankruptcy, economically, intellectually, scientifically, and had to get back on track. And so he orchestrated new campaigns of perestroika, or restructuring, reconstruction, and glasnost, which meant candor in public speaking. And so it was an amazingly different climate. This was the dawn of democratization of the Soviet Union. It turned out to be a process that Gorbachev found extremely difficult to manage. It got out of his control, and other politicians, some were very conservative who didn't want any of this change, and there were others like Boris Yeltsin who saw this change as an opportunity to become kind of a political shooting star. And so Boris Yeltsin got out in front of Gorbachev and was proposing far more radical and faster reforms. Then in 1990, you had an attempted coup by certain conservatives in the Politburo and the military against Gorbachev. It ultimately failed, and this was Yeltsin's great opportunity to make his mark when tanks are rolling into Moscow to get control of the crowds, the pro-democracy crowds. Yeltsin stands out in the street and stops in front of a tank and so on and so forth, and makes a speech and is there in front of the cameras and becomes kind of a celebrated world figure as someone sticking up for freedom and whatnot. So the Soviet Union quickly after that dissolves, and Gorbachev becomes irrelevant because the presidency of the Soviet Union is no longer a position. And Boris Yeltsin, as president of Russia, now is at the helm. Yeltsin will sign off on the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's split into 15 separate republics, now all independent states, which was an astonishing development, but kind of free fall, from a flying airplane in a way. Nobody quite knew what to do. How you manage a transition from a tightly controlled society, managed from the center, with a strictly controlled economy, negligible private enterprise, how you do that and suddenly become a democracy and a free market capitalist state. It didn't work out as well as people hoped, obviously. Yeah. And we don't need to go through all of that. Some have contrasted it with the Chinese approach, which was to gradually embrace economic reform without embracing any political reform.
Yeah.
So that was an alternative, but it was an utterly fascinating moment to be there in Russia and to see what was going on. I would then, came back to Russia repeatedly. And spent a lot of time there in 90, 91, 92. 92, I got to have a brief teaching opportunity at the Bashkir State University in Ufa, which was also utterly fascinating and presented totally unanticipated opportunities. I ended up, for example, teaching a history course that was made mandatory for their equivalent of ROTC students. So it was seemed rather ironic that you had an American professor now teaching Russian cadets, in effect.
Yeah, that is a wild situation.
But there you were, and it was also funny to get to understand the politics of the situation. While I was there were some members of the history faculty, mostly older folks who were conservative, didn't like the changes happening in society, and weren't particularly pleased that I was there. And you also had a cohort of young scholars who were kind of happy that I was there and very interested. I also had the support of the resident rector or president of the university and the vice rector, who both of whom I got to know very well. So that was a fascinating experience to kind of take the pulse of the country in a non-Russian region as well, since the Bashkirs are historically Muslim and nomadic and so on. So a very different culture from the Russians, but they were assimilated over the course of a couple of centuries in the 1700s and 1800s. And a portion of my research, including, I think it was probably the second article I ever published, was about the incorporation of the Bashkirs into the Russian system of military service, which seemed quite interesting to me at the time. And so this was a great follow-up. So a lot of interesting things happened by virtue of those trips. And I kind of got into the habit of making almost annual visits in the summertime to travel and see people and try to do some research and whatnot.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in many ways, then you really were like a product of the Cold War era, because your whole career trajectory was based around the Cold War. If there wasn't no Cold War, you may have never gotten interested in Russian history in the first place.
It would have been quite different in all probability, because it made such a strong impression. We talked about sports during the Cold War era. Sports became one of the outlets, in effect, in the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War, the term suggests it's not a hot war, not a shooting war.
Sure.
So it became an ideological and political conflict by and large. You had episodes like the war in Vietnam or the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where we were clearly at odds, but where generally Americans and Russians never confronted each other directly. Now, there were a few instances when that wasn't quite the case, and the unofficial rules of engagement for the Cold War were that we wouldn't talk about it. For example, United States learned during the Korean War that some of the North Korean pilots were in fact Russians. And we just, weren't going to make it an issue. The Truman administration didn't want to incite the public into some spasmodic reaction that might complicate the politics of the war or possibly expand it. So both sides kind of agreed we won't talk about stuff like that. But as I said, sports were one of those arenas, and it ranged from chess to hockey to the Olympics. And as it happened during my year at Moscow University, this was the prelude period up to the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, which were anticipated as an incredible event in Russia. This was to be the Soviet coming out party. This was going to be affirmation that the Soviet Union was a big international player, widely recognized around the world as not merely a factor, but a positive factor in international politics and whatnot. It so happened, however, that the Soviet invasion, as the U.S. termed it, of Afghanistan took place in late December of 1979. This was, again, while I was there. And that had huge political repercussions. I might also note parenthetically, in a wildly bizarre coincidence, at the very time the Soviets were staging their invasion of Afghanistan from Tashkent, who had decided to take the advantage of winter break at Moscow University to go travel to Central Asia, and including a stop in Tashkent.
Yeah.
So that was all kind of funny, although I had no idea what was really going on at the time. But President Carter responded very angrily to the Soviet move in Afghanistan. It was a complicated picture. The use of the term invasion is complicated because the Soviets had already had a presence in Afghanistan, kind of the way we had one in Vietnam. Only the difference was the Soviets now engaged in a major escalation with a very large infusion of forces. They also deposed and executed the sitting president of Afghanistan. They had decided he was a liability. So while there's some analogy there are some other points of divergence. But Jimmy Carter thought that this was kind of a betrayal of an understanding on the part of the Soviets, that neither side was going to make a move that was so disruptive and so provocative. And indeed, we know since then that even within the Soviet Politburo, there had been some misgivings about what they would be getting into in Afghanistan. There were some senior Soviet military figures who argued this is not a great idea, or that this might require much greater force than the government is anticipating. One such figure is someone I later met, a General Guriev, who was one of those who had warned the Politburo that this wasn't going to be risk-free, that there were massive problems that they were going to encounter, and of course they did, as we know. But back to where I was, the final card that Jimmy Carter decided to play after announcing that we would cancel grain sales to the Soviet Union and impose an embargo on certain things. That in addition, the United States would organize a boycott of the Olympics in Moscow in 1980. So this was a huge political deal. Of course, it was potentially ruinous to the kind of glorious spectacle that the Soviet Union had wanted to mark its coming out party, as the 80 Olympics were supposed to be. I just have to emphasize how public the emphasis on the upcoming Olympics was in Soviet life. There was a calendar above the entrance to the dining hall, for example, at Moscow University, and they would mark off each passing day on the route to the Olympics, for example. And there was all kinds of Olympic promo material and so forth. So they were very anxious for this to occur. At the same time, I would have to add, and I learned this from friends in Moscow, that there was a very different kind of campaign being conducted among the Russian population, that KGB and the Communist Party would organize meetings at places of work, warning people it's not a good idea to fraternize with the foreigners when they're here. And they're spreading rumors, all kinds of absurd things, such as they might be carrying, foreigners might be carrying chewing gum, for example, that will be infected with sexually transmitted diseases or some other absurd nonsense. And also that it was, they would ideologically try to poison the minds of Russians. In fact, there was a concerted effort to get Russian kids, Russian youth, out of the capital for the Olympics. They organized all kinds of special summer camps and other things to get them out of the city for when the Moscow Olympics would actually take place. So it was overall a pretty bizarre set of circumstances that was taking place. The U.S. did organize the boycott. It got substantial support. There were about 40, 45 countries that joined the boycott. Some halfway joined. I think the British, for example, sent an Olympic team, but they wouldn't formally represent the United Kingdom. They would just come there as a group of independent athletes and participate as competitors. So many countries participated, but a substantial number did not, and it certainly took some of the luster off the games. In retaliation, the Soviets would boycott the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, the 84 Summer Games. So there was tit for tat, and I was a little surprised they did that. In fact, it was probably the one time that I made a public prediction that turned out to be all wrong. Because I can remember being interviewed by a newspaper in Illinois about the Olympics. And I said, I just don't think they're going to boycott. I said, the Soviets invest so much in winning the Olympics. The propaganda boost is so great, they wouldn't want to give it up. Well, it turned out they did. So
wrong. Okay.
Yep, that's it. Let's come clean. I was wrong.
Yeah.
I still think, although I would still argue they made a mistake. It was the wrong move.
Yeah.
But they didn't come. So sport was a venue where this stuff played out all the time.
Yeah. So after the Cold War, what future did you think was in store for the U.S. and Russia?
For a brief time, the prospects looked pretty good. In fact, even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was a big uptick. In 1989, I remember the West and Americans and the United States were immensely popular in the Soviet Union. As an American in the USSR, I'd always enjoyed a degree of celebrity status from the very first visit because Americans were so rare.
Yeah.
And Russians were so fascinated to meet you. It was like a Martian had suddenly landed on Earth, and they had a chance to talk to you and ask questions. So there was that kind of experience again and again and again. And then you had this high watermark of Western popularity in 1989. Then you had the breakup of the Soviet Union as a result of the coup attempt in 1990. But by 1992, the bloom was off the rose a little bit because the economic reforms weren't working very well. And the U.S. tried in many ways to help, but the U.S. really didn't know how to fix this problem. How do you make this kind of incredible societal transition. Soviet pensioners, for example, were in a terrible spot because inflation ran crazy, and pensioners had fixed incomes that didn't keep up with inflation. So a large part of the population immediately became impoverished,
right?
Which, needless to say, wasn't very popular.
No.
Then, during the Soviet era, they had an awful lot had been done to stigmatize the idea of free markets and private enterprise. Everyone was a cheater, an exploiter, and so on and so forth. And after a few years, this perception of economics started to return as people couldn't afford to buy things. And you quickly had a sifting of Soviet society into classes of people, some of whom seemed to have plenty of money, and others whom were on the brink of destitution. Meanwhile, in the background, a lot of the former Soviet leadership who knew which buttons to press were becoming extremely wealthy. Many from the KGB and the Ministry of Interior, as well as some from the party, were becoming amazingly wealthy because they knew how to privatize much of what had been, state factories and industries, and particularly natural resources like oil and gas, and so on. It was such that we were concerned in 1996, the United States was concerned, that the communists could actually win election back into power.
Oh, wow.
In Russia.
That's interesting.
Boris Yeltsin was running for re-election as president in 96. And of course, I made my regular summer trip to Moscow to get a feeling for this. And I remember the commercials. The Yeltsin campaign had a couple of advantages. Yeltsin had friends in the media, and so he got overwhelmingly friendly media coverage. And so the television was full of ads warning of what it would be like to return to communism. And they invoked memories of the terror under Stalin and the purges and the Civil War and the arrests and so on and so forth. Do you really want to go back to this? Meanwhile, the Communist Party had very little advertising and really wasn't good at running a political campaign. They'd never really had to do it for real, because all the campaigns in the Soviet era had been carefully rigged, and the final outcomes produced ludicrous totals. With Leonid Brezhnev, for example, I think in 1980, pulling about 99%.
Sounds accurate.
There were some districts in which he got over 100%, which was pretty
over
impressive.
100%. That's really impressive.
Just shows how the get out to vote work thing really worked. In fact, I did know of a couple of Americans there who'd been invited to come down and vote because they were so gung ho to maximize turnout for the elections. Now, of course, the numbers were faked, because someone I knew worked at the polls and was involved in the process and counting votes and whatnot, and explained to me when I asked. I could remember she looked at me as though I was kind of naive. Said, well, of course, we make up the numbers.
Oh my gosh.
So back to 96 then. I guess that my point is the Communist Party really didn't have much experience running a regular campaign. So Yeltsin was able to leverage a lot of advantages, including support from the United States and elsewhere, where we desperately wanted him, not the communists, to win. He was trailing in the polls, I remember, in June of 1980, and that's when folks got really concerned. But he won.
Yeah.
And his health was in decline, pretty soon thereafter, and even during the campaign had been open to question. Plus, he had some public appearances that were less than great. He was known to be a big drinker, if not an alcoholic, and there were some campaign appearances in which he was obviously pretty wildly drunk out there dancing with a band and so on and so forth. It was pretty crazy, but he won. But he wasn't going to hold on for long, and of course, he finally will handpick Vladimir Putin to be his successor, and Putin will take over in 2000.
Yeah.
So anyway, the experiment with democracy slowly contracted, and part of this happened on Yeltsin's watch, even though he had been the great spokesman for democracy. He had been the first to start trimming democracy a little bit, making the presidency a good deal stronger, the parliament a good deal weaker, and doing some other things that centralized power. Putin would expand on these extensively, as we've seen in the last 20 years. But the trend away from democratic norms was started under Yeltsin, and under the eyes of the West, who felt, well, we need Yeltsin to win.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. So I guess then it's not totally surprising to see the current status of the US and Russia today, then, since it seemed like that experiment with democracy in Russia didn't work very, very long, and now it's been basically the relationship has just seemed to be drifted further and further apart over time.
Yeah, part of that I attribute to, a lot of it I attribute to Russian domestic politics.
Yeah.
There was a lot of psychological carryover still from the Cold War, and I think it was still something of a reflex for some Russian leaders to view the West with extreme mistrust, which contributed to a perception of things like the expansion of NATO into what had been the Soviet bloc, first states like Poland, and then subsequently places like the Baltic states and Estonia and whatnot. They were able to cast a kind of a menacing hue over all that, as though this was aggressively anti-Russian. Plus, there was some political advantage domestically to taking that line. It justified further restrictions of all kinds on society, geared up. It was not that hard to reconstruct kind of a Cold War mindset, dressed in a slightly different way.
Sure.
The Communist Party was no longer at the forefront. The Communist Party had been discredited, and the turn was instead to Russian nationalism. And as luck would have it, in the eyes of a Russian historian like myself, there was an enormous effort to mold the narrative of Russian history, especially Russian military history, to make it seem as though Russia was always beleaguered, and it has always been the military that has been the bulwark of Russian strength and independence, and of national values, and so forth. So that campaign is becoming extremely strong.
Yeah. So when you think about the era we're living today, and you have obviously spent a lot of time reflecting on what it was like living during the Cold War, and now we're witnessing a world that's obviously has major wars going on in Europe with Russia invading Ukraine, and we have an election in the US where a lot of people will argue like democracy is at risk a bit with the matchup at play. How do you think people then should kind of approach a time of uncertainty like this, given, I mean, you lived obviously through it certain times of the Cold War where you weren't sure if your country is going to get nuked or not in a nuclear war. How do people kind of approach these historic times that they live through?
That's a great question, and it's extremely difficult, to read the mind of an entire country. You can locate pretty carefully your own perceptions and the perceptions of people in your immediate circle. It's a little harder to spot sometimes broad emerging trends. I mean, one of the amazing things about the incredible discord of the Vietnam War domestically was how it rather suddenly subsided in the 1970s. Of course, ending the Vietnam War and leaving had a great deal to do with that, but the Vietnam War had created a significant rift in American politics, and a lot of folks were wondering, where society was heading, where American foreign policy was heading. We became somewhat isolationist for a bit, but remarkably, there was an unspoken desire in many instances that folks wanted to get back to some kind of normalcy. So that could happen again. But one of the striking perceptions that I have from that period is that rather quickly, a lot of those wounds, internal wounds, healed in the country, and off we went. So it's often very difficult to tell, and we'll have to see where we are beyond the point of the current election. The media environment, of course, is vastly different. The media influence on the politics of the period of Vietnam was considerable. I mean, one of the most recent developments, at the time, in 1964, the U.S. put up its Telstar satellite, which is what enabled, not quite real time, but same day communications and video and reports and whatnot from Vietnam, which began to shape American perceptions of what was really happening there, as opposed to the impressions conveyed during the Second World War, when all there was official reports that were always positive. So very different. And now with the immense wildcard of social media and the fact that folks can circulate all kinds of nonsense widely. And in fact, we've got lots of research, somewhat done by folks at Dartmouth, that shows that the crazier the post, the faster it circulates. So this is something we haven't quite figured out. And this is also something that our adversaries are involved in playing. I mean, there are contemporary news reports. It's kind of strange that Iran is interfering with media tools that are oppositional to Donald Trump, while you've got China interfering with opposition to the Harris campaign, and Russia also. It's pretty wild. But that's the crazy thing about the social media environment. It's a global environment, and again, we simply haven't figured out how to deal with that. And the public is slow to come around sometimes to the ways in which they can be manipulated.
Yeah, it's definitely been a big can of worms, and it seems like there's a lot of debate about what's the best way of doing this. Given the questions of free speech involved, with how do you monitor people on the internet? Then how do you obviously people don't want the government to have a role in that, but obviously if the government could play a role, if technically people are starting to break the laws, through through what they're posting online, if they're inciting violence, etc. So And then can you trust tech companies to actually regulate this stuff in a common sense way? And it seems
Well,
like
yeah, it's a
there's no
terrible dilemma.
balance.
It's
Yeah,
a huge dilemma because if you see free speech as a key to free inquiry, in the manner that the English philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote about in On Liberty, in which he essentially argues that free inquiry, free speech is the key to it, to advancing it. Any restrictions on it are highly problematic. But what do you do when there is so much misinformation that's being thrown out there, and it's very hard for people to empirically determine that it's false, especially now that you throw in artificial intelligence. We've only begun to
yeah,
tap as a possibility. It's a terrible problem, and it's very hard to reckon with because you see enormous pitfalls whichever way you go.
yeah. Yeah, it is like you're gonna step on a landmine any direction you move. So, but at some point, I mean, if things, I imagine if things do get crazy enough where society really starts to fall apart more and more over time, then naturally there's gonna at some point someone's gonna step in and try to take control of whatever the result of that is going to be, because certainly these things will lead to some type of societal change in some direction at some point.
Mm-hmm.
It's right now we're just seeing how it plays out. I
Yeah.
know in Europe they're reacting a little bit differently than the U.S. They tend to be fairly aggressive about um, trying to get a control over social media, while the U.S. is a little bit more seems wait and see. So I guess we'll figure out what the best methodology is. But
Yeah, and what you fear is an outcome like what you have in Russia, where social media is largely state
yeah,
managed and used to put out official messages only. To the extent that there is diversity in that social media space, it is of a chaotic sort, because it seems Russia has found two ways to approach this simultaneously. On the one hand, there is consistent, strong, highly reinforced official messaging from the government, particularly with respect to the state narrative. The Russian historical narrative has gotten incredible play in recent years. I'd say parenthetically, probably there's no place in time in history where historians, the historical community, has had such a role in state politics, including oversight of projects to create what's known as the ideology of the future, for example. But on the other hand, as some savvy internal Russian media observers have pointed out, Russia also lets chaos loose there, and all kinds of crazy narratives get out there that are highly contradictory. The point being, in the estimates of some, that the different and opposing positions are so contradictory and so impossible to verify that people tend to wonder whether you can believe anything, which again creates a psychological environment where sort of default to the official narrative is where people will tend to congregate.
yeah. Well, I guess we'll see how that plays out. Hopefully, there's some type of common sense strategy going forward, but it'll be a while probably. And what are you
Could be.
currently working on then in terms of your research?
Um, I'm I've gone back 100 years in
Okay.
time to get back to working on the Russian or Red, the reconquest of Central Asia. I mean, there had been an earlier collapse. The Russian Empire dissolves as a result of the 1917 revolution, and there's a vast civil war across the Russian countryside. And some parts of the empire, for practical intents and purposes, fall off because the center can no longer control them at all. Once
the Reds have largely consolidated power inside Russia itself by 1919. And then 1920, they returned to the task of trying to cobble the Russian Empire back together. And this includes trying to subjugate an emergent resistance movement in Central Asia, which is a very complicated scene with many layers of politics and whatnot. But I'm going back to doing a lot of work on that, and recent time spent in Tashkent helped me along with some of that research. The last article I wrote is probably more pertinent to our discussion today, and that's an article about the construction of Russia's ideology of the future, which was published around a year ago in the journal Military Review. So if folks want to find that, it's not too hard to search for. But it's a story of how the Russians have tried to construct this historical narrative, and then integrate it into their interpretation of current events, and build what is, again, termed ideology of the future around this set of historical ideas about Russia, what is essential to Russia historically, what is essential to Russia in the future. This is harmonious with views formerly put out by Putin and the state, but it's not one and the same. Putin doesn't appear to be directing this, except in the sort of the most general way. He's willing to let all the debate take place among the players, and he stands aside. So I mean, you could argue in that sense there's still an element of intellectual freedom out there as folks fight over exactly how this should look.
Yeah.
In any case, that tells us a lot about the current mindset of Russia. So
Definitely.
history is constantly moving and ever interesting.
Yes, that is true. It never stops. Well, then I guess the best way for people to follow your work is go on a Military Review, or I guess on Amazon you have some books there. And
yeah, the Army University Press ultimately has all the books I had a hand in, plus numerous Military Review articles. They're all accessible through their website.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And or you could go directly to Military Review for those articles. But Army University Press is a pretty impressive free resource. That is, all the articles, all the books are downloadable as PDFs.
Oh, okay. So they're all free then there.
They're all free. Now you can
Wow.
buy hard copies in the U.S. government bookstore.
Yeah.
But they're all downloadable as free PDFs, and there's actually quite a resource there.
Cool. Okay. Well, I guess you're not on social media yet, but maybe one day you'll be on somewhere. But until then, yeah, cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your stories, and very interesting times historically. And obviously, we're now living again in interesting historic times. So interesting thing for people to kind of compare and contrast.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation.